Okay, so we have been talking about Elinor Ostrom, who spent decades trying to figure out how to sustain the commons without causing tragedies of the commons and actually leading to triumphs of the commons. And she decided after a lot of work, a lot of case studies, that she couldn't actually put down rules and regulations for sustaining the commons, but she could come up with the design principles to sustain the commons. So we'll look at those and look at some examples of case studies to see how the principles actually hold up when you look at hundreds of case studies, or at least tens of case studies, let's say, and it continues to be so according to the works or continued works of Marco Jansen as well and his co-author here. The key concepts in this chapter: be introduced to design principles for effective institutions which are necessary to sustain the commons, learn about boundary rules, monitoring, graduated sanctions, and input of local participants to collective choice arrangements. So the penalties don't come at once. You keep violating the rules of exploiting the commons together with others, then your penalties keep going up, and we'll look at an example of how this works in real life as well. See how violations of design principles may lead to corruption and rent seeking, which is basically exploitation of people who are using the commons as well. Let's start with the example of paper parks that we talked about before, where there are protected areas on paper, but implementation doesn't happen, so they just become called paper parks. If so many hectares of land and ocean are designed as protected areas, why is there still so much overfishing, deforestation, species extinction, and plundering of many natural resources? Fisheries is a good example, and so is deforestation, where you have protected areas. People value forests in many ways. People love eating fish, but fish is not like agriculture where you put some seeds and you harvest the product, right? So somebody tried to explain to me that she doesn't eat meat because she cannot give birth to animals, whereas she can produce vegetables and crops, grains that she can eat using seeds. So that somehow makes it feel better in terms of not eating animals but eating being a vegetarian. So fishing in that sense is there is a stock that you need to sustain and keep fishing without overfishing, so that you draw down the stock and make it go extinct or become economically unviable for fishing. But already fisheries businesses across the world are heavily subsidized, so the price you're paying for a fish on your plate is probably much less than what it should be if you did all the calculations on how much money was put in to go get that fish and bring it to you and be processed and so on and so forth. One of the problems is that areas might be protected on paper in official legislation signed by officials in suits, but there are no effective institutional arrangements and associated infrastructure on the ground to support this legislation. Again, fishing and forests are a good example. You see the deforestation of the Amazon. You read a lot about how it may have become a source of carbon now instead of being a sink, and how this may be lost completely if we are not careful, and so on and so forth. So essentially, it's not the lack of regulations and legislations, it's the lack of implementation that is causing these exploitation of the commons beyond sustainable exploitation, right? So here is some illegal logging in West Kalimantan's Gunung Palung National Park, so that's Indonesia. Hardwoods are being trafficked by a timber baron in the town of Ketapang. So here again the question is, whose fault is it? Is it the timber baron, or is it the demand? Are people buying without knowing where it's coming from? There are lots of labels of child-free carpets and dolphin-free tuna and so on and so forth, but can you even make sure of the sources and see how they're being harvested, right? This is what we talked about before. It's not uncommon that areas are officially protected, but some high-ranking officials have received access to harvest timber, such as is happening with the national parks in Sumatra. During his dictatorship in Indonesia, Suharto gave timber rights to powerful military leaders to buy their support for his regime. He was a dictator who needed the military to stay in power. As a consequence, the official national parks are now heavily deforested. How can we establish parks in practice instead of simply parks on paper? This is what it comes down to in terms of design principles for sustaining the commons, right? As introduction, what is the best set of rules to govern the commons? This is the ultimate question asked by policymakers involved with making common pool resources and with managing, common pool resources. It would be lovely if they could make them. So policymakers involved with managing common pool resources and providing public infrastructure. Unfortunately, there is no such optimal set of rules. What we have learned over the years is that there are some design principles that explain why some communities are successful while others are not. These design principles are based on a systematic study of many case studies of fisheries, irrigation, groundwater and forestry systems. Some of these cases were discussed in the previous 2 chapters. Information was collected from each case study regarding the size and composition of the community, the formal rules and norms in use, how the system was monitored and by whom, the conflicts that arose, and how the resource systems evolved over time, right? The history of the evolution of the system, the culture around it, the norms and expectations, etc. matter, and these are always case studies, as we said, and there is no blueprint, as we will see. So some communities are successful while others are not, so you cannot take a blueprint around saying do this and you will succeed. So it's learning by doing, as we already talked about before. Let's quickly touch on the institutional design principles before we move on to the details. The design principles derived from case studies of long-lasting systems of common pool resource governance. So you do things, if they work, then you try to extract the principles that made it work over a long enough time, right? Clearly defined boundaries is the first one. The boundaries of the resource system, for example, irrigation system or fishery, and the individuals or households with rights to harvest resource units are clearly defined. So whether it's irrigation or fisheries, we talked about fisheries before in Turkey, and this is how the boundaries have to be defined to be sure that the design principles can be built around that. Proportional equivalence between benefits and costs. Rules specifying the amount of resource products that a user is allocated are related to local conditions and to rules requiring labor, materials and or money inputs. Okay, so cost benefit is always important, and proportionality or proportional equivalence between benefits and costs is also critical. Collective choice arrangements. Many of the individuals affected by harvesting and protection rules are included in the group that can modify these rules, so that it's not a top-down imposition by, let's say, a colonizer, a dictator, which tend to fail. So here it's a collective choice arrangement. Monitors who actively audit biophysical conditions and user behavior are at least partially accountable to the users and or are the users themselves. So it's not, again, external security system which is given to corruption, poaching, exploitation beyond the setup boundaries and collective choice arrangements and so on. So monitoring is very critical, and who monitors it is also very critical. Fifth one is graduated sanctions. Users who violate rules in use are likely to receive graduated sanctions depending on the seriousness and context of the offense from other users, from officials accountable to these users, or from both. So you are part of the system where your penalties are going to keep ramping up if you keep failing to meet your obligations to exploiting the commons. maybe we shouldn't be calling it exploiting, I should call it harvesting the commons, right? Conflict resolution mechanisms should be in place. Users and their officials have rapid access to low cost local action situations to resolve conflict among users or between users and officials. Minimal recognition of rights to organize. The rights of users to devise their own institutions are not challenged by external governmental authorities, and users have long-term tenure rights to their resource. So it's a relation built on trust, credibility, and legitimacy, so that people know that they are in good hands and they are doing the right thing, while others are also doing the right thing, and whoever is not doing the right thing gets punished, right? Penalized. For resources that are parts of larger systems, nested enterprises become part of the design principles. Appropriation, provision, monitoring, enforcement, conflict resolution, and governance activities are organized in multiple layers of nested enterprises. We'll look at examples of these. We talked before about such action arenas. You have the university, you have the departments, you have the admissions, you have teacher in the classroom, students in the classroom, and so on and so forth. So every system you pretty much deal with in real life is a nested enterprise in some way. We will now look at each design principle in more detail. Although the design principles are intended for natural resources, we'll illustrate their use with other kinds of systems too. Okay, so I'll leave this here and we'll come back and look at examples of design principles for these 8 institutional design principles that we just went through. Okay, so we'll come back and do that in the next podcast.